why she continued to film her reports despite being warned by national security officers.
Maybe I have a rebellious soul. I'm just documenting the truth. Why can't I show the truth?
I've been speaking to our correspondent in Beijing, Stephen McDonnell.
The hearing lasted only a few hours, and then Zhang Zhan was found guilty of picking quarrels and provoking trouble and given a 4-year prison term. Now, this crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble is something that dissidents often find themselves charged with and, in fact, imprisoned for. You know, she's described as a citizen journalist, but reporting very much that of an activist, I guess you could say. She was in Wuhan in the early weeks of the coronavirus outbreak and posting footage of overcrowded hospitals, the chaos, what she would say is the lack of good information. And in China, you know, you can do many things, but you can't criticize the Communist Party, especially when it's trying to put forward a completely different narrative, that the government has handled the outbreak so well, that it's all been controlled splendidly. And sure, the government does have a lot to crow about in that respect. I mean, anyone who's been to China recently would be able to tell you that very much things are under control here. But in those early days, it was chaotic and there were problems. There were allegations of cover-ups and the like. And that now is something which is not going to be permitted by the government.
Is this a sign of how sensitive China is specifically about its handling of the coronavirus in the initial stages of it and wanting to really control the narrative?
Oh, it's definitely a sensitive subject. I mean, just to give you an example, the BBC World TV's coverage of this is being censored. We're not able to get on screen to talk about this because everything we report's being blocked. But there is an added factor here in that there were several of these citizen journalists who've been detained. But she had a few runs on the board, though. She's been detained several times for challenging the government. At one point, she held up an umbrella in Shanghai in support of the Hong Kong students, for example, with a slogan on it calling on the Chinese government to resign. Now, that is a very sensitive thing to do. And so it's not the first time she's gotten into trouble, and I think also that partly is the reason why they've given her such a tough sentence.
And how are people like Zhang Zhan portrayed in the Chinese media, or is all of this not covered at all?
I think there won't be much coverage of this at all, to tell the truth, because even speaking ill of her is to raise the question of, was the coronavirus managed well? So I think there's most likely to be very little, if any, coverage at all of her sentence.
Stephen McDonnell. In August, a group of Hong Kong activists attempted to flee the Chinese territory to Taiwan by speedboat, a more than 700-kilometer journey, but they were intercepted by the Chinese authorities. 10 were charged with attempting an illegal border crossing and have today appeared in court. Diplomats from several Western countries have been blocked from witnessing the case. Outside the court, the veteran Hong Kong politician and activist Lee Chuk-yan said the justice system was being used to silence dissent.
No one had any faith in this judicial system that will give the people any chance of a fair trial. We only see black hole and we only see suppression.
Well, let's speak to our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton, who joins us now. Celia, just remind us, first of all, who these activists were and why they were trying to flee.
Well, most of the 12 activists who were caught on that boat were actually out on bail. They were facing charges in Hong Kong relating to last year's anti-government protests. The 12 had evidently been involved in quite an elaborate operation to try to flee Hong Kong. Their destination was the independently ruled island of Taiwan, but really they didn't make it very far past China's maritime border before they were picked up by the Chinese Coast Guard. Now, since then, they really haven't had any access to independent lawyers. Their families had been pushing for the 12, which includes 2 minors under the age of 18. They'd been pushing for them to return to face trial in Hong Kong, but the Chinese authorities have rejected this request, and that's why they're facing charges in a Chinese mainland courtroom today.
And is this another example, as we just heard there from Stephen McDonnell, of the Chinese government silencing dissent?
Well, this is a tricky one because the 12 were, the authorities say the 12 were caught breaking the law. They were caught trying to cross an international border illegally. And many of the 12 were caught trying to jump bail. So it's difficult here because they've allegedly been caught trying to break the laws that didn't have much to do with their political stance. Now, we go beyond that to say that they have been subjected to quite a harsh treatment in the Chinese legal system. They haven't been given access to speak with their families or international or independent lawyers. And of course, one of the reasons this case is being processed today, we think, is because it's kind of lumped in with that group of cases, including the case of the citizen journalist Zhang Jian, which was just mentioned earlier. It's the Chinese government's way to process politically sensitive trials around the Christmas period in an attempt to avoid international condemnation. So yes, the Chinese authorities are trying to avoid, they are trying to silence dissent by trying to push this case through today.
Celia, thank you. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton. Hundreds of British tourists are reported to have fled the Swiss ski resort of Verbier to avoid having to quarantine. The 10-day isolation period was ordered by Switzerland's government after the discovery in Britain of the new, more contagious variant of COVID-19. The country, like many others around the world, banned entry to travellers from the UK on the 20th of December. Imogen Folks, our correspondent in Bern, tells me more.
It's a little bit unclear, but it does look as if dozens, up to 200 or maybe even more, British citizens in Verbier left overnight. It would have been difficult to depart, I think, during the day because they were supposed to be confined to their rooms and the authorities were checking on this. They were supposed to be quarantining for 10 days because they'd come from Britain out of precaution to prevent this new strain of COVID-19 spreading. But obviously, if you've booked a ski holiday and you get there and you find you're quarantined, so you're just looking out at the snow rather than skiing on it, it's not great. And it looks as if lots of British tourists chose to leave overnight, driving across the border, possibly hiring cars, up to the Channel and home to the UK. Certainly, there have been one or two tweets on social media which suggest that this is exactly what happened by people who did that.
Was it a case of they arrived there and then quarantines were imposed, or was it a case of a quarantine was imposed retroactively while they were already there?
For most, and I think this was frustrating, it's likely to have been imposed retroactively because what happened was the Swiss government, like every other government in Europe, got news of this new strain of the virus which originated in the UK, desperate to stop it spreading. Switzerland is struggling with a really bad second wave at the moment, and imposed quarantine for anyone arriving from the UK after December 14th. Now, lots of people from Britain were already here, already skiing, already hoping to have Christmas on the slopes. Many British have their own chalets in Verbier. It's nicknamed Little London. So then, of course, they were told, sorry, back to your chalets, stay in, we'll bring you food. Some were even delivered free champagne by the authorities, apparently. But you've got to stay in for those 10 days.
How is this being viewed in Switzerland?
It's kind of mixed. The Swiss decision to open their ski slopes for this winter season is controversial among the Swiss too. Some people say, no, we should wait a year. Other people say, it's my favourite afternoon in winter. I'm not doing any harm. Let me do a bit of skiing. I think hand on heart, not that many Swiss people were keen on lots and lots of tourists from abroad coming. But obviously that's what's going to happen if you're the only alpine country with slopes open this winter.
Imogen Folks, you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Now, John has the headlines.
A Chinese journalist who helped reveal the scale of the initial coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan has been jailed for 4 years for her reporting. A prominent Saudi female activist who campaigned for women's right to drive has been sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. And the Afghan authorities have promised to double the number of police in Kabul in response to a spate of targeted killings.
Thanks, John. Millions of U.S. citizens struggling with the financial impact of the coronavirus pandemic will soon receive one-off payments of $600. The money is part of a $900 billion stimulus package reluctantly signed into law by President Donald Trump, who dropped his threat to block the bipartisan bill after appeals from both Republicans and Democrats. It's another moment of political drama in the final days of the Trump presidency, but this package will help many families doing it tough, as Emily Moffat, who lives in Annapolis, Maryland, told the BBC.
It's very exciting, and I hope that that's true so that a lot of families can get, stimulus and relief, and all the people who are still struggling with unemployment don't have to face such grim news at the holidays and the beginning of a new year.
Mr. Trump's belated signature will also avert a U.S. government shutdown from Tuesday. Our correspondent in Washington, Nomia Iqbal, considers why Mr. Trump changed his mind.
The yeas are 359, the nays are 53.
This was a deal that had support by both Republicans and Democrats, but not by the president.
A few months ago, Congress started negotiations on a new package to get urgently needed help to the American people. It's taken forever. However, the bill they are now planning to send back to my desk is much different than anticipated. It really is a disgrace.
As he played golf over the last few days, he was pressured by both parties to sign the bill. The consequences of his inaction were immense. Up to 14 million Americans face losing their unemployment benefits temporarily and being evicted from their homes. The bill now changes that. The government also faced being shut down, as a lot of money was needed for funding government agencies. There will now be help for small businesses and money for vaccine distribution, amongst other things. In a statement, President Trump didn't say why he changed his mind. He said more still needed to be done, including increasing the individual payments to Americans. Mr. Trump also pushed the one thing he remains focused on, claims of election fraud, which are unsubstantiated, and demanded action on that too. But he is only president for less than a month, and his requests are likely to be ignored. This last-minute turmoil has now been averted and instead provided much-needed help for a country that continues to suffer under the pandemic.
Nomia Iqbal in Washington. People across Europe have started to receive the coronavirus vaccine, with countries including France and Italy beginning their inoculation programs. More than 14 million people have tested positive in Europe, and strict lockdown measures are currently in place in nearly all EU member states. Our correspondent Bethany Bell has more from Vienna.
The first vaccinations took place yesterday. The first person to be inoculated was an 84-year-old woman who said that she wanted it because she wanted to be able to see her children, her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren without having to worry. And watching that vaccination was Austria's Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, who called this a game changer. And we've also seen the vaccine being rolled out in countries like Italy, where the first person to be vaccinated was a 29-year-old nurse. She said, again, she hoped that this was the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Italy's Prime Minister calling this a day that would never be forgotten. Many of countries are prioritising people who live in old people's homes, care homes, nursing homes, and medical staff, people with the most exposure to the virus. But in some countries, a handful of politicians were among those being inoculated first, including the Czech Prime Minister and also the Greek Prime Minister, which is being seen, I think, as a way of trying to increase public confidence in the vaccine amid some vaccine hesitancy in Europe.
Bethany Bell. A 5-year-long study of the Atlantic Ocean has discovered 12 species previously unknown to science. Most of these dozen new species are deep-sea corals, which scientists describe as the cities of the deep. In the course of 45 expeditions, the researchers used new underwater robotics and deep ocean sampling to study the Atlantic in unprecedented detail and to understand how ocean life is being affected by climate change. Victoria Gill reports.
Whipping up the sand along the beach, but it's making for quite a bleakly spectacular view along the coast.
I'm on Crosby Beach in the northwest of England, a gorgeous wind-swept stretch of sandy coastline. I'm here for a socially distant walk with Professor George Wolfe from the University of Liverpool. He's a researcher whose ocean exploration has earned him some scientific bragging rights.
George, you have 2 species, not from this study, but previously they're actually named after you.
I do, yeah, amazingly. So they're both very small and ugly, but one of them is a little fish, a snail fish, and that's called Parapolaris wolfii, and the other one is a sea cucumber that's called Benthodites wolfii.
Well, that's very impressive.
In a year when so much exploration came to a sudden halt,